Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Stories from the Field Oral History Exhibition at the Reher Center. Before we get started, I just have a couple of quick housekeeping notes and community guidelines to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let me know in the chat box with a direct message, and I'll do my best to help you out. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, as well as a PDF of the slideshow, is going to be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. We will be doing a brief Q&A at the end of the presentation, but feel free to send your questions throughout the chat box at any time, and then we're going to get all through them at the end. And we do ask that you hold each other with mutual respect, come to this space teachable, and stay engaged with our presenter throughout this program. So now I just wanted to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York program, just in case any of you are unfamiliar with us. DHPSNY, as we like to call ourselves, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives and the New York State Library, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives and libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and condition surveys, strategic planning assistance, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. So to learn more about our services, please visit us at dhpsny.org. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to Sarah to get us started today.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And this is my first time doing a webinar for DHPSNY, and so bear with me if it's wildly different from when you expect. And I will be talking about, I'll introduce you to the Reher Center for Immigrant Culture and History. I'll talk about a little bit who we are, then the origins of this oral history project and how it was then transformed to a gallery exhibition. So let me get started. So the Reher Center, the exhibit's called Taking Root, Immigrant Stories of the Hudson Valley, and it is at the Reher Center for Immigrant Culture and History in Kingston, New York. And just to give you a little background about us, we are in Kingston, which is a medium-sized to smaller-sized city, formerly quite industrial, now in the process of reinventing itself in many ways, but it's a very interesting place in that it has, on one hand, a lot of gentrification, weekenders, Catskill, sort of upper middle class weekenders type, and people buying weekend houses and such, and also a very large immigrant population and a high poverty rate. So a very interesting mix. And so it's sometimes hard to know who our audience is. And so we work on trying to meet everyone, which isn't always easy. And we are located in a historic bakery that was owned and run by a family of Eastern European Orthodox Jews, originally from Poland and Russia, and was a bakery from 1908 to 1980, run by two generations of the same family who lived upstairs. And so we have some historical spaces. I'll get back to our mission in a sec. We have two historical spaces. One is the bakery retail shop, which is where, of course, people would buy bread and some groceries, and also our historic oven room. And this is our 1916 era portable ovens, and they're quite impressive and decrepit in their own way. And so our mission is to foster belonging by engaging all people through culture, community, work, and bread. Together, we preserve and explore our historic bakery site and honor its legacy by amplifying Kingston and Hudson Valley immigrant voices and contributions, past and present. So we have this historic space downstairs, and then upstairs, we have a relatively new gallery that is in the space that had been the hayloft, because they had a wagon and horses who would deliver the bread around town. And so that's the hayloft. And now it's a lovely gallery with bathrooms, which was a new thing for us, and an office. So we've created that space. So I showed you our retail shop and our oven room, and we have tours of the historic spaces on weekends in season. And that usually is about May to November. This year it will be later because we are fixing our roof, which is a big, big deal, huge project, as you can imagine, grant largely grant funded, and so we are not able to open entirely to the public until later, TBD. And we also keep the gallery open at the same time that the tours are Saturdays and Sundays, and we're usually open Friday afternoons, Saturdays, and part of Sunday for gallery visitors as well as tourists. So Kingston, as I described it a little bit to you, and we are in the Rondout neighborhood. Kingston has three distinct parts, and the Rondout is down towards the creek, which goes into the Hudson, and it had been the epicenter of much industry and shipping. They shipped coal through there, lots of industry based on the waterfront, and it was a traditionally very working class immigrant neighborhood. In the late 60s, early 70s, it was pretty much entirely destroyed by a urban renewal project, which did not get completed. So they raised, you can't see in the other, so the left of this photo across the street from these buildings, it's some new buildings. That entire neighborhood was destroyed and it was never rebuilt. The only reason the side of the street where the Reher Center still exists is because they ran out of money. And so now the neighborhood is in its process of rebuilding and gentrification, but as you can see, it's taking a very long time. That's us, sorry. On the corner there with the yellow, the building at the far right, and the one next to it are our buildings. The apartment upstairs will eventually, hopefully, be interpreted, and maybe the top floor is going to be archival and offices. Next door where that little awning is, that's the oven room, and above that is our current offices. So the Kingston Immigrant Oral History Project started 2 springs ago. And the idea was that part of our mission is, as I said, is to share immigrant stories of the Hudson Valley, but there's not a lot of primary sources about those stories. And so when there was ARPA money for museums and libraries to partner, the Reher Center and the Kingston Public Library decided to create this oral history project and got some ARPA money. The interviews would become part of the Reher Center's permanent collection and be made public. And we later decided to turn them into a gallery exhibit. But from at the very start, the idea was to have this collaboration with the library and to simply record people's stories. The Kingston Library and Reher Center worked together on this. And we started by creating a community advisory committee. The idea being, who are the different communities in Kingston who will have access to immigrant stories? And what kinds of questions should we be asking? So that from the very start, the idea was to be a sort of participatory project, community participation and sort of shared authority, as they say. And we reached out to all kinds of different groups, and the members of this committee both came up with our list of interview questions and helped us reach out to individuals who might be willing to be interviewed. We also partnered with Bard across the river in that a professor worked with us and his students were some of the interviewers. And that includes native Spanish speakers, as we call them. And so that from the start, having interviewers who could speak Spanish was very helpful. So as I said, part of the project was finding our storytellers, and the committee helped us find some. And we also had these informational fairs, also at the farmers market, Kingston Library, at any kind of event where people might be coming. And we had people sign up and learn about the project. And we got about 19 people from the Kingston Library portion for the first part of the project, the Kingston Library. People would come and do these interviews at the Kingston Library, which was they worked with us. It was partially their project, and they had a very nice community room upstairs. It's a very nice building. And we had weekend and evening times. And one of our board members, meanwhile, is a photographer, and she works in tintypes largely, not only, but it's really her specialty. And she offered to do tintype portraits of the storytellers. You'll see some of those in a little bit, but this is one of her process pictures. It's this massive camera with the whole thing over your head, and they're on a metal plate that she then processes. And I've seen she would do the process right then and there. And it's fascinating to watch it come to life on the metal plate. She can show you for part of it. She's under a cover, so like a mini portable dark room, that's the word. And other times it comes out and you can see it develop, and it's fascinating. It's really fun. We also tried to get more money. We tried to get some more ARPA money and had this big proposal in conjunction with the Ulster Literacy Association. So we wanted to work with them. They have a whole roster of English language learners, and we thought that that would be an interesting way to bring more stories and to widen the scope of our stories past Kingston proper and to get more and more people involved. And Amy Leonard of Ulster Literacy was very excited about this, and we had this whole idea for to do more interviews, but also to expand to, for example, with agricultural farm workers in conjunction with Farm Hub, and to make an exhibit and to have an English language learning curriculum. It was this big project, but we didn't get it. So it's an example of, you have all these ideas, they don't always work. And yet, Ulster Literacy was still very enmeshed in the project and very invested in it. And so they helped us do more interviews. We had a workshop with Dr. Willa Chen, who's at the Culinary Institute and does foodways studies. And it's not the exact name for her program, but that's what it means. And she's very involved in oral history. So she helped us train some of the English language tutors to interview people. And we had a training with them. And so we did about 17 more interviews. So we pretty much almost doubled the size of our interview store. This picture is one of those tutors in this Ukrainian Catholic church in Kerhonkson, New York, which used to have may still have a Ukrainian resort. And people would come up from New York City to stay in this place. And people over time bought property around there. And there's this Ukrainian Catholic church. It's a big community. So we had a number of people who were involved in that church, including the priest. You'll see his picture in a bit. So these interviews are available at the Kingston Library's website, but also through New York Heritage. So they're publicly accessible for free using these two different ways. And they also have the pictures of the thumbnails of the tintypes. You can see the face of the person who's being interviewed. There's transcripts. And all in all, it's a public resource. So these recordings are part of our permanent collection, but they're also a public resource that can be accessed by anyone. So, am I going too fast? I'll try to slow down. So, the next thing we realized was, well, we needed to have what's going to be in our gallery. At the time that all these interviews were going on, we had an exhibit about sewing in Kingston, called Sewing in Kingston. The Kingston had multiple sewing related factories from the 1910s through the 70s, and making all things from women's dresses to pajamas, curtains too. And it was a huge industry. And so we had a whole show about that industry and how it changed over time, the connections to the New York City garment industry, things went to outsourcing, et cetera. And I worked on that. And so that was what was in the gallery at the time, but we knew we needed to be thinking ahead to the next show. And I said to my colleagues, well, we're putting all this energy into these interviews. I think that this is a really exciting resource for us, and it's absolutely on mission. And what is closer to our mission than literally getting these stories out there, getting people's personal stories of immigration to the wider public. And so we decided we would move forward and turn recordings into a gallery exhibit. And as you'll see, this had all kinds of pros and cons. But so for example, recordings are intangible, right? They're sound. So how are we going to do that? And we have words, of course, we can use transcripts. And of course, we had the tintypes as well. So those are our resources. So we had to start thinking about how this would work. And we went around thinking, how do we make it a physical space? How do you have a place where people can go to listen? How are you going to do this? And we found inspiration in a thank you note. One of the interviewees, one of the storytellers, was from Peru. And just that she happened to be from Peru, doesn't matter where she was from. And she wrote a thank you note to my colleague, Sarah Litvin, saying that after she said, I'm almost 60 years old and my roots are not here. Today, I've had a chance to flourish again and take root in this new land. And it turns out she's involved in theater. She has a wonderful way of expressing herself. And this idea, however, that the interview itself was a meaningful moment for her in feeling heard and feeling seen, and it made her feel like she was finally recognized and able to make Kingston and this part of her home. And that was very moving for us. That meant a great deal to us. And so we embraced her metaphor of taking root for our title and our design, how we were going to create an experience using these recordings. And in a little bit, I'll also talk about how we decided to make the exhibit bilingual. And you can see already I've put our logo here, right? And it was fun. We worked with an exhibition designer, Cesar Zapata, who is from Colombia himself. And he doesn't do a lot of graphic design, and he felt strongly about the branding of the show. And he has a friend in Colombia who does branding, and he said, this guy will do it for free because he wants to build his international portfolio. And so we had nothing to lose. And so he did this wonderful work and gave us all kinds of examples of different brand possibilities and fonts and designs. And when maybe many of you do graphic design, but for me, I've learned a lot about graphic design in my museum work and how powerful it can be. So it's a really another interesting experience here of pulling together different perspectives, right? And so he came up with this. In the end, he and his colleagues came up with this logo that was about, growing upward and growing down into roots. And that was sort of our metaphor, right? Our metaphor for the entire project. And making it bilingual is very important to us. So we've got this metaphor, we've got this idea of roots and growing. And I already had that quote. Sorry, I put it in there twice, whatever. We embraced this and we turned this idea into trees. And Cesar said, he said, I think of diversity and think about it as almost biodiversity. So he had this tree, this botanical metaphor going, and taking root, and we'll have a forest. And that, you start off with the grand ideas, then you have to be pragmatic. We had a very limited budget, very limited space. It's a rectangular gallery with parts of it are not usable for us. So essentially 3 sides of a long rectangle are useful. And we also have to use the space for other things. We have school programs in there. We have small fundraisers. We have classes, public programs. And so we couldn't do a lot in the middle of the space. We had done that for the Sewing in Kingston show and had to move everything each time we had some kind of program, which it could be done, but it was an added layer for a very small staff to address. So we didn't want to have too much to move out of the way. Okay, so we're not going to use things in the middle of the space. We're going to have things along the wall. And so we came up with these trees. We call it the forest. The idea was that each tree represented a fundamental theme in the questions or the actual questions that the interviewers asked. And so each tree represented a form of shared experience What was your experience in arriving in the US and in Kingston? Or have you felt, what kind of welcome, if any, did you receive? Who has been helping you? How does language factor into your experience? So each tree represented a question that was sort of a, pretty much everyone had some relationship to that question. But everyone's relationship to those issues is different. And so the individuals were the leaves. And as you see in this mock-up here, we had about 6 or 7 stories, excerpts represented on each tree. And at the top of the tree, we called it the canopy, had some response that I found somehow particularly moving or effective for that question. And then each leaf would have a little version of the tintype portrait and a response to the question in both English and Spanish, and a little bit of biographical information about that speaker. And then down below, we also had laminated transcripts because, again, I'll get into the recordings in a minute, but if you didn't want to listen to the story for whatever reason, you could also read it, or you could read it in the language that you needed. So, so here's a picture to give you a sense of the final product of the forest component of the exhibit. And you'll see there was like one, and I had to work hard to pick each story, right? To pick each segment that was going to be there. How could it be? It had to be fairly short. It had to be, I wanted a representation of genders and places of origin, ages, experiences. And so it was a huge puzzle and very interesting work to do, but it took a long time. And you'll see the transcripts hanging down. What you also see are the little QR codes, those little black and white squares. So that's how we ended up making the recordings accessible. We went through we considered a lot of options about how to make the audio accessible. And if anyone listening, watching has worked with sound, you'll know that there's no perfect solution. If you have it be ambient, meaning in the whole space, it's more environmental. It feels more, it's less, you don't have to work to get that sound. You just walk into a space and there it is. But then everyone is hearing the same thing, and it doesn't focus on the individual you might be wanting to hear about. Or there are these things called sound cones that sometimes you stand directly underneath it and it directs that sound to you. Those were way past beyond our budget. We thought about those like little telephone things, again, way too expensive. I talked to people who do different kinds of personal museum tours and little sort of proprietary gadgets and things like that. All of it too expensive. And so we ended up using QR codes, and we worked with a company called QR Tiger. Don't know why there's a tiger, but they can create QR codes for you. You send them all your recordings, and you send them files, and they give you unique QR codes that will link directly to those files. And we paid money. You can do this for free, but when you have a subscription with them, you can change the codes if you need to, change the files. They're more flexible, and they'll give you some tracking information. So we could tell who was looking at which stories were more getting the most hits per se. And so that's what we chose to do. But it was still much less expensive than the other technologies that we considered. The downsides of using QR codes are that we had to up our Wi-Fi. We had to renew that and update it so it's better and pay more for that. And people are using their phones. And so there is this element of, I'm using my phone in the museum, and that automatically creates a distraction. Also, we had to teach people how to use QR codes. We had to create instructions for that. And some people, especially on the older members of our board, were resistant, and they didn't think people would want to do this. People do not listen to as many as we'd hoped, but they do listen to them. So it was the best we could do, can't do it all right. So that's the forest. You'll see, so another big debate, in addition to how to manage the audio, how to engage with the audio, was about stuff, okay, objects. So as I say here, one of the big challenges was a big internal debate about objects. At the start, we'd made an assumption that we could borrow objects from our storytellers and sort of put them on the wall somehow. This was before we had the forest idea, but even after we'd considered the forest, we thought we'd have shelves with different objects maybe. And very soon, it did not take long, very soon we learned that this was not going to be very easy at all. Some people were eager to share things with us. And we soon realized that those people tended to be more established, more economically and legally stable. And while we could have borrowed such things, it would have privileged those more secure storytellers. And we had one of the more telling moments was one of the English language tutors was talking to her students about maybe lending objects. And someone said, I don't have anything. I came here with a backpack on my back. I don't have anything. Someone else said, well, I have my grandmother's rosary, but I'm not lending it to you. We just had not built up, we didn't have a strong enough relationship with the potential storytellers to borrow such things. Now, that group to which she was speaking, they did not, in fact, do interviews with us. They were considering it, and then we essentially ran out of resources and time and weren't getting it. We'd reached a sort of a point at which we had to stop asking people to interview. But it was a telling moment, right? It was an important moment for us to realize, okay, we're not going to use objects because using objects has an is inherently unequal. It's inherently privileging people with more stability of whatever kind. And so we decided to focus on the stories and our photographs. We decided that we really would focus on the recordings as the artifacts, as the treasures per se. And I'll play to the recordings in a minute. This is an example of one of these tintypes, meanwhile, that we could use, right? So here is an example of one of our stories. She emigrated from Vietnam, and this was her, let's see if it's Hope Place.
Was there anything that was a challenge for you when you came to the US?
Yes, like first the different language, so we speak English all the time, and I don't really feel difficult about that too much, but sometimes we like make a phone call or something like that. Sometimes I wasn't able to do it by myself, and I need my husband's help.
So that's an example of one of the stories that's on the language tree, right? Her particular experience with language. And we didn't frame it in terms of, actually, that one might be on the challenge tree. As you see, sometimes stories could go different ways. Sometimes you might ask about what was a particular challenge, and the challenge would be regarding language. So I might have put this story on either the language tree or the challenge tree. I can't recall at this very moment. Other times it was immediately obvious what tree it might go on. I'm going to bring you in. So another one. This is a clip from a man from El Salvador. So he was one of the people we reached through having the pastor of the church was on our committee, right, on our community committee. So his was about in the language tree.
¿Y cómo fue si te puedes acordar de Rubén, ese niño Rubén cuando llegó? ¿Cómo fue su experiencia en middle school?
Difícil, porque cuando yo empecé, como usted dice, yo no sabía inglés. Es difícil, porque en ese tiempo en las escuelas, bueno, al menos en la que yo iba, casi no habían niños hispanos, niños latinos. Eran más americanos de otros países,
Ujú.
En la middle school a mí me costó, porque no hablaba inglés, me costaba comunicarme con ellos y todo. Pero ya en la high school fue un poco más diferente, porque yo ya sabía un poco.
So that's an example of one of our Spanish language interviews. And another, oh, I'll get to that in a minute. I'll go back to that. So one of the big decisions we had to make at some point was, how are we going to address language, especially when a good proportion, at least a quarter, if not a third, of our interviews are in Spanish, or at least partially in Spanish. And we decided very soon, very early on, to do what we could to make the exhibition bilingual. And we believed that, first of all, anyone who had participated deserved to have their stories be communicated to as many people as possible, right? So we didn't want only the Spanish interviews to be accessible to people who spoke Spanish. But Kingston has a large Spanish-speaking community, especially a lot of Guatemalans, but of many different origins. And how we're going to do this, and it took more. We ended up doing, as you see, each of these has English and Spanish. It caused design challenges. For example, it takes more room. You have everything, and also everything needs to be translated. I could do some of it myself when I was listening. I could understand it enough, and looking at the transcripts that already existed, I could understand a great deal. My Spanish isn't great, but I can read and hear and read and listen as I read. Not bad. But then we paid native Spanish speakers to do the translations of the text. Again, two different people are Bard students, so we paid them to do this. And we also, when we had our opening, we had a interpreter to do a Spanish language tour, and she actually recorded that, so we have it if we need it again. And it was worth it to us to put a little more time, a little more physical space, and more money into doing this as equitably language-wise as well. And I skipped a picture. So about the objects. So we decided not to have objects, but we wanted to welcome more ways of telling personal stories. And so at the short end of the gallery, we have a TV, and we created a slideshow, and all the storytellers were invited to send us personal photos, and they could be photos of people or photos of objects. So that was a way that if someone did have an object, they said, oh, I have this cookbook, for example, or I have this thing that was my grandmother's, or then they could take a photo of it, and then we'd put it up, and they could write the captions for it. So this was a way to try to level the playing field in terms of access to objects and telling more stories. We did not receive as many of these as we'd hoped. Not everyone did share them, but we have a number of them, and they are good. This one I find very moving. This is from one of our storytellers. He's from Bolivia, and his caption was, "The mother I left to come here." So it's, people's stories. Another element of the exhibit is food. And many, many people talk about food in multiple ways. And food is, of course, a universal experience. It's a place where people hold memories, very powerful in terms of identity, of where you're from, what you've left, but also how you integrate, how you become part of a new place. And also a way for visitors to build empathy and interaction. So instead of it being part of the trees, we created a picnic table with the red and white tablecloth in the middle of the gallery. And we created these we call them placemats, and because they're about the size of a placemat, and they're laminated, and there's a whole basket of them. And you can look through the basket and then sit down if you want at the table. This sort of sit down with me, sit down at my table kind of metaphor. And each placemat has it's both sides, and they have a big photo of a particular food that someone discusses in their interview. In this one, as you see in the picture, this is sancocho. This is a Latin American, South American kind of stew. Many different cultures have their own version. This story is from that same Peruvian woman who's taking root metaphor was so useful for us and so moving. And so we had their story in English and then in Spanish, no matter what the original language was. And then that you see that white space there, that's actually where the QR code is. So you can listen, just like in the forest, you can then listen on a phone to that particular story. And on the other side is sort of information about that same kind of food. And it's a little background. And students at the Culinary Institute did that research for us. So a little background on what sancocho is. And then also on that same table, there's a basket of tools, cooking tools, like a tortilla press or a rolling pin used to make soba noodles in Japan, and another basket of little jars of spices. Both the tools and the spices are related to the dishes that people discuss. Here's some more of those tintypes. UDIT created, we have tintypes for everyone except 4 different people, and who, for their own reasons, chose not to have photos taken, and that was fine. And these photos, she's a immigrant herself from Hungary, and works mostly in this technique, and it's a 19th century technique. And she explained it to me, and we have part of the exhibit explains the process and her reasoning behind using it. And when you look at old 19th century photos of immigrants, say, coming to, say, Ellis Island, they're frequently tintypes. And her argument is that immigrants from the 19th century are romanticized and sort of heroicized in many ways in this country. Oh, my grandmother came through Ellis Island and she worked hard and she pulled herself up by her bootstraps, etc. And here's her picture. And so she likes to use this technique for present day immigrants as a way to connect that experience and to contrast in some ways people's attitudes about immigration today. So these are 4 different people whose stories are represented in the show. And here it shows you the wall where we hang the tintypes, and you'll see that there's the tintype portrait. They look very dark here. They're not quite that dark, but they are dark. And then there's biographical information and a little clip of how that person identified themselves, and like sort of a story about, there's no audio to it, but part of their interview that had to do with how they described themselves. A great deal of this felt on me in terms of choosing what to use, but it was also very important to us that we try to integrate the storytellers as much as we could, and that they feel at ease about being part of an exhibition. We didn't want to be extractive, right? So we had an event with them to discuss the exhibition. I sat down with each person. Is this extract okay? How do you feel about this? And most people said that's fine. Every so often someone said, I'd rather use something else, or could we fix my grammar? Usually you wouldn't normally do that with an oral history, but this isn't pure oral history. This is people's personal stories. And so if they had a small grammar thing or the way they spoke and they wanted to address it, in a few cases we did a little cleaning up, but not much. You can't change the recording, but in the text we could. And people were part of the opening in this photo, and they're always invited for free. We also have a few ways for people to participate. They can write, they can listen, and they can read the transcripts. We have a coloring book for people coloring things that this child has made here. What's your dish that you would make on a placemat? We have a notebook for when you smell those spices, what does it make you think of? And we invited people to send their photos to us to integrate into that slideshow. No one has. And we have these leaf-shaped Post-it notes where people can write their own stories and stick them on a certain part of the wall, such as this. This one says, I come from El Salvador. I came here in 2005. My life is now in this country, but I miss my roots. So this is my spot at which I'm going to say, ask me questions, and I'll answer them to the best of my abilities. So, Leah, you are going to run the chat, I believe.
Yeah, so we're just gonna give folks a minute to type in.
Right. I'll also put this is our social accounts and our website. I'll go back to that. Now, Leah, I don't see the chat myself right now. How can I do that?
As of now, we don't have any questions yet, so
Oh, okay.
I will let
Got
you
it.
know if they pop in.
Please do. Shall I stop the share? Or should I leave it on this?
You can just keep it up as this. I think that's fine. Do you have a personal point of pride in this project?
Oh, okay. I do really like the variety of stories that we were able to, not just in that, oh, look at all the people we talked to, but that I worked hard to get a real variety of examples of people's experiences. And some are, happy stories and some are not. And some are someone, for example, one is, why'd you come here? And her answer is, I didn't want to come here. My husband brought me, or there's a lot of different ways. I'm pleased with all the variety that you see. That there's a lot of different ways that people answered the questions, different ways people engaged with the interviewers, different ways people told their stories. So I like that. It's full of surprises. It's not predictable. I also love the placemats, I have to say. I think they're really kind of fun. There's a certain engagement, like as if you're picking what you want for dinner, and then you can sit down with it and look at it and listen to the stories. It's kind of fun.
Lovely.
Challenges and disappointments, we have those too.
Okay, so we have gotten some
I see that.
movement in the chat. First is not a question necessarily, but a comment from Amy saying, I have no questions, but I'm in awe of how thoughtfully you approached every aspect of this oral history project.
Oh,
It's like an amazing experience. And I agree with Amy. I
you.
think this is a
Thank
really cool
you.
program.
It's very
So
kind.
Oop, go ahead.
Oh, I said that's very kind. Thank you.
First question we have in the chat is, can you speak again about how you chose/found the interview subjects?
I didn't actually do that, so I can only tell you about how my colleagues did it. One, there was a bunch of ways. One was that through, of course, personal connections. So, for example, my colleague's husband is from Honduras and he came to do an interview, right? So some of that kind of personal connections. Many of the storytellers came through connections through that community advisory committee. So having established that committee was very important for us, sort of theoretically, in sort of the way we wanted to do it, but also pragmatically in that they helped us reach into different communities to which we might not have had access, like the Salvadoran church, for example. And then some of it was sort of after they had a table at library events and Reher Center events and at the farmers market, come talk to us. Do you want to tell your story, kind of thing. So active solicitation.
Okay, very cool. Not sure if you would know the answer to this one since you weren't really involved in that part of the project, but do you know what kind of consent form the project used for the participants?
We definitely have a consent form and I can try and find it for you. I'm sure they used a template from someone from sort of best practices, that sort of thing, but we did use consent forms and we had them in Spanish and in English. We also had separate consent forms for the photos. So I can't tell you what kind, but it definitely said that you have my consent. Here's what we will use it for. I understand that it will be part of the permanent collection. I understand it will be online, all of that. So we did that properly. We had to hunt people down sometimes. There's always with those consent forms, people didn't sign them at the right time, and then we go back and doubled back and make sure we had it all.
Mhm. Did you face any criticism once the exhibit was installed?
I haven't heard of criticism in terms of content. I do know that not everyone loves using their phone for QR codes. That the people think it's fussy and clunky. We do have some iPads that we use if people don't want to use their phone or they do not have a phone that can work in this way, because it has to be a smartphone. So if you don't have that, we were careful to have that in case so that it was, again, accessible. We want it to be as accessible as possible. So the biggest critique I've heard is I don't like using the QR codes. People do say, well, how do I get my story here? And so we don't, it's not so much a critique as we would love to have more people do it, but the project isn't ongoing. And so it's hard when someone says, well, how do I do this? To say, oh, well, we're not doing it now, but we'll take your name and number in case we do it again, kind of.
Mhm. And speaking of doing it all again, this sort of leads nicely into our next question, which is, are there plans to do something similar with stories from earlier immigrant groups in the round out, or to intersperse their stories to this project?
When we initially envisioned the project, we thought we would be swapping things in and out. We thought we would be able to add new ones. So far, we have not. The exhibit's supposed to be up this summer, so this spring and summer, and then come down, although we're considering leaving it up because in some ways it works like a permanent exhibit for us in a lot of ways. We get push and pull about that. Right now, there's no active program to do that. That said, we love to, and we do interview people in the Rondout. That's a separate project, and we're trying to do some of that. People who have Rondout stories, particularly of the neighborhood. We have also had community listening days. So we've had a few days where we have a little workshop about how to do an oral history interview. And here are some skills that you can take home, and then you can share your stories with us if you want to. And we did another day where we were soliciting some more interviews about immigration, but those have not been integrated into this because there's a lot more steps to do that, creating the QR codes, creating the stickers, where do they go on the trees, who do we take out? So I would love to, in many ways, I would love to. In other ways, the logistics and the funding so far have proved to be too big a barrier.
This next one is half comment, half question. I love the idea of using the tintypes. The rationale is spot on. Connecting immigration today with past waves of immigration is really important. Are there other ways in which you have thought about doing that?
Well, it's not in this exhibit, but one thing we're working on now is enhancing our interpretation of the historic spaces downstairs. I showed very briefly a photo of the retail shop and of the oven. And so, and those spaces you can have a tour of them and they are partially interpreted, but we're working on making it more so. And part of that involves having new stories. And so one of our board members, her family has a Guatemalan bakery in Spring Lake. No, I don't remember the name. Spring Valley. And so we're working with her to start soliciting stories of modern or contemporary immigrant bakeries so that we can integrate those stories into and combine and compare and contrast with the story of the particular family's bakery where we are. So we'll say, well, the Reher family did this and this, but a contemporary immigrant story with a bakery would do this and have videos, to include some videos in that. So that's how we're trying to have that sort of past and present thing. It's very different from the tintypes, but to sort of, you're in this historic space and you're learning about this particular, Polish, Jewish, Orthodox family and what their experiences were like, and how do you then bring in other stories? So we're working on that. It's not quite the same, but sort of in theory, it's the same thinking behind it. So hope that answers your question.
All right, and I think this is looking like it's going to be our last question. Any suggestions for oral history resources for museums looking to start their own small programs?
There's a lot out there. right? I really like the National Council on Public History's resources. I would recommend looking at those and on their website. Columbia University has a whole oral history program as well, at least used to. I think they still do. We worked closely with Willa Chen at the Culinary Institute, and she doesn't do this. It's not as if she's a resource for everyone, but I recommend finding someone who, so not just resources in terms of best practices or suggestions, but someone who's done it. And she was very helpful for us in terms of training new people and training the interviewers and, excuse me, and being a help when it came to, if you're going to make it community oriented, you have to sort of let go that everyone's going to do it great, that you have to be welcome a more community level of expertise, and that's fine, right? But how to set some expectations and have some training. So someone with hands-on experience who can come to you and work with you would be really helpful. I was, like I said, I wasn't part of setting up that part of the program, so that's why I'm being a little vague. I don't have exact details on this is how to do it, because I wasn't part of the project then. And so, but I do know that National Council on Public History would be a good place to start. I do believe there is a National Oral History Organization too. So hope that's helpful.
Great. Fabulous. It looks like there's no more questions, which is kind of perfect timing because we're a few minutes shy of our 3 p.m. end time. So I just want to thank you all for attending today, and thank you so much, Sarah, for presenting. This was really interesting. And good luck with the exhibition for this season. Thank you all.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure. Thank you very much. Good luck, everyone.
Bye. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, Leah.